retired Air Force colonel, spent 27 years in the United States Air Force, and during that time frame I fought in the Vietnam War, flew as a fighter bomber pilot, and in 1966 was shot down over North Vietnam, was captured, and spent 6.5 years in the North Vietnamese prison system.
Could you please tell me your perception on how we got involved in the Vietnam War?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Chris, because I think it's very, very misunderstood. I think they have to go back and study the Truman Doctrine, and then they have to learn about the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. The Truman Doctrine, of course, was 1948, and it basically stated that we would hold the line against international communism throughout the world as far as we could. And the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was an organization that was comprised of 6 different countries in Southeast Asia that were being threatened by communism. And South Vietnam was one of those. South Vietnam came into being as a result of the split of North Vietnam between the communists and what we hoped would eventually become a democracy in South Vietnam. And a lot of people don't really understand how we got into it. We had treaty commitments that really determined we would get in there. And we got in there, of course, from under President Kennedy initially, and all the way through the rest of it.
What was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization?
Well, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was set up basically after the fall of the French in 1954, and the spread of communism was imminent in that part of the world, and it's very much the same as our NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is in Europe and that part of the world. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was comprised, of course, of the United States, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and South Korea. South Korea, of course, they had just fought their war against the communists, so they were very strong in being members of the CETO alliance.
How does that correspond to our involvement in the war?
Well, as our CETO alliance, our CETO commitment to help our alliances defeat communism over there, and at the time that the French fell in 1954, a lot of the Vietnamese moved to the south because they didn't want to be under communism, and they set up the government down there, and we supported that government. Well, then in that move south, there were many, many communists who moved south with them, covertly. That means they came into the villages, mostly rural areas, and had their cadres there to set up the Viet Cong. And basically that's what it was, the Viet Cong. And then in the early 61, I believe it was, 61, I was at 61 because it was after President Kennedy took office, the battle over there, they needed help. The South Vietnamese army asked for help and training. So we sent people over there to train. We sent a lot of special operations people. We sent Air Force pilots over there to teach their pilots how to fly. And that went from about a commitment of 16,000 or so in 1961 or 62 to well over 30,000 or so by the time that President Kennedy was assassinated and President Johnson took over. So that's basically where we got into it. And then, it slowly escalated. As the Viet Cong got stronger and the North Vietnamese started putting more and more troops in there covertly and sending them more and more ammunition, material, and everything else, then our involvement grew and grew until it became a full-fledged war.
What branch of service were you in, and how did you get into that branch?
Well, I was in the United States Air Force, and I got into that branch in 1955. I had qualified for a program called the Aviation Cadet Program. And I went in as a cadet and went through pilot training for just a little under a year and a half, and won my commission and my wings as a pilot. And that was my career. After a few years in, I really liked it, so I decided I would stay in and make a career of it. So I went through a number of programs, flew fighter interceptors in the United States and Canada, instructing pilots in a number of different instructors, and then back into the fighter business. And when Vietnam got hot and heavy in 1965, I volunteered to go in the 105 program, which was our fighter bomber that flew most of the Air Force missions over North Vietnam. And at that time they started a program called Rolling Thunder, an operation called Rolling Thunder. And so I went through the training over here at Nellis Air Force Base, and then was assigned to Krat Air Force Base in Thailand, where we flew the 388 Attack Fighter Wing, flew missions out of there against the North Vietnamese. And it was then in 1966 in September, and I was flying a mission over the north and got shot down by 85 millimeter anti-aircraft. I was very fortunate to get out of the aircraft because I was very low to the ground when I got hit before I was able to get out. But I managed to get out, got first and second degree burns, but otherwise not injured too badly. But I was captured immediately.
Describe what happened while you were taking capture after you were shot down.
Well, as I mentioned, I was shot down by 85 millimeter anti-aircraft, which was all radar controlled and very effective. And I lost total control of the aircraft. It just went into a ball of flame, and I managed to get out at the last second. Landed in a rice paddy, and before I could even get my radio out to call my flight and tell them I was alive on the ground, I was hit by the North Vietnamese and captured. And they hauled me up, stripped me of my flying suit, my G's, took everything off except basically my underwear, and then they hauled me up to a little shack and held me up there for the rest of the day. Our mission was an early morning mission, and the thing I remember most about that was as they were taking my G suits off, they had a great big machete, and the G suit zipped on and off. And I don't think those people fully understood the zippers at that time, and they had this machete. They were trying to cut my G suit off with a machete. And while one of them was standing there holding his old French rifle at me, I wasn't sure it was going to go off before they got the G suit off. But then I was held there for a day until that night, and then they put my flying suit back on me and started me hiking. And they hiked on, I was barefoot, they took their boots off, and they had kind of a gravel road, which was a very rough, it was kind of a karst, what they call, made out of karst, which is a white limestone. And it was crushed up, so it's very sharp on the feet, barefoot. And they marched me, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours that night, until they got me to a small village and went into some interrogation and some difficult times from there.
Was anyone shot down along with you?
No.
Did you have any fellow Americans alongside you or anything like that?
No, I was flying a single seat fighter, so I was the only one that was shot down. And I did hook up about 3 or 4 days later. I don't remember because I kind of lost track of the exact days. 3 or 4 days later, I was put in a boat and hauled across this river in the middle of the night and put into a big weapon, kind of a 6x type truck. And I didn't realize that it had a lot of boxes in it, crates, stuff like that. And I was all tied up and trussed up, and I was sitting in one back corner of this thing. And then by daylight, they found a place to park the trucks where they were camouflaged, which was a good thing because otherwise my guys might have bombed us. But then I heard some whispering, and I realized that there were 2 other guys in the truck with me, Americans. And I got one of the guys I had known from a previous assignment back in Virginia.
Did any of the Vietnamese speak English?
Not at that, well, when I was being held at this village, there was an English-speaking interrogator. Didn't speak good English, but he spoke English, an interrogator. And other than that, no, none of the guards spoke English at that time.
How were you transported to the prison that you were taken to after being shot down?
Well, as I mentioned, I was shot down near the town of Vien, which is 100 plus kilometers south of Hanoi. And I ended up in this truck with these 2 other POWs. And we traveled, as I remember, probably 2 nights, maybe 3 nights before we arrived in Hanoi. And we arrived in Hanoi and in darkness, and were blindfolded and hustled out of there and taken in and put into this filthy little cell. The cell was about probably 4 feet by 6 feet, and a concrete floor, and a smell of urine. And it was filthy. And they had one little bunk in it that had leg manacles on the bottom where they could lock your legs in. And I was stuck in there. They didn't lock my legs in, but I was put in there at that time. And then who was there for about 10 days, went through a lot of interrogations and some rather brutal treatment, where they would lay you down on the floor and put a rope around your back, your arms and your legs, and stretch you up and pull you like that. And basically, they were trying to get some military information, but mainly, as we realized later, they were just seeing how difficult you were to break so that they could use you later. But I was there for about 10 days, and then I was taken out again at night, blindfolded, and put in a truck. And where I was put that first time is what we called, what was the press called the Hanoi Hilton. We called it that particular part of that big complex, and it was a big complex. That particular part of it was 8 cells we called Heartbreak Hotel, for a very good reason. And then after that, when I was taken to this other camp during that night, it was went to a camp called the Zoo. It was named the Zoo by the POWs there. And again, I was solitary, put into a cell, but it was a bigger cell. And it had, the cell described there was probably about, maybe about 10 feet by 10 feet. And it had 3 bunks in it. And the bunk is basically just a wooden platform. It had rings at the bottom, or holes in these big hardwood planks at the bottom where they could tie in your leg irons if they wanted to put you in leg irons. And and I was there, I think, that night. The next afternoon, about middle of the afternoon, the camp got pretty quiet because the guards all kind of went into a siesta mode after the midday meal. They got up really early, and so they had kind of a siesta mode. And I'm lying there on my bunk, and the room is about 10 by 10, totally closed in. There's a door, solid wooden door, and it's got a little, probably about 8-inch by 6-inch trap door that they could pop open at any time to check to see what you were doing. And that's, the guards would walk around and they'd come up and pop it open and make sure that you weren't doing what you weren't supposed to be doing. Well, what we weren't supposed to be doing, I soon came to realize, was communicating. I was lying on my bunk and I heard this noise on the wall, a tap on the wall, and it was tut, 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 which is very American. Shave and haircut. It's an old song, my generation, that everybody knew. Tut, 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 tut. But it was a tap, tut, 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 on the wall. I said, that's got to be American. So I went over the wall, and the answer to that was tut, tut, because that was the end of that little beat. And so I tut, tut. And then all of a sudden, here came all kinds of tap noises through it. Well, I don't know what this means. I said, is it SOS? Finally figured, I said, I don't believe it's SOS because it's difficult. It was all taps and no dashes. So it took me several days to kind of figure that out. And I finally, I won't make it a long story, I finally learned the tap code. And the tap code was the basis for our communicating system over there. And if you can imagine our alphabet having 26 letters, and we drop one letter, it makes it 25, and you draw a box that has 5 down and 5 across. Okay, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. No K, because that's the letter we dropped, because K and C are phonetically the same. L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. And that was how so 2 taps like that is A. That's B, C, and that's how we communicated. And we would have to listen very carefully, and the only thing we could watch in the guards was you learned your shadows, and you could sometimes, most of the times, tell when the shadow was like that a guard was walking by and coming close to our room, and that's when we'd have to quit communicating. But we got caught communicating, and inevitably it created some more punishment.
Describe the physical tray to the prison.
Well, our clothing first, we were giving 2 issues of what we call pajamas. They were kind of red and pink striped pajamas, and long pants, long sleeves, and then 2 pair of shorts that you could wear underneath it. And when it was hot, you just wore the shorts in the room. But anytime you went out, the guards made you put on the long clothes. The room was, as I said, about the one I was in initially, and that does vary because I went to a lot of different rooms and a lot of different camps. But this initial camp was basically a 10 by 10 room. Could accommodate 3, but I was in her solitary for about 4 months before finally one day, after an interrogation and some very rough treatment that I can describe to you if you'd like, And about 3 days later, I was called into an interrogation, and here sat 2 other Americans. And we ended up they moved them in with me in this room. So we had 3 of us in this cell for quite a long time after that. But the physical thing of the cell was, like I said, had the door, had the little trap door that they could peek in on you. Our toilet was a bucket over in the corner. It was a bucket, maybe about, 4-gallon bucket, maybe a 5-gallon bucket if you're lucky. And that was your toilet. And most of them were old rusty things. They rust on the top. You couldn't sit on them. You had to squat on them. And that was and you got to empty that once a day. And sometimes you would get to take a bath, and you took your bath out of a well, pulling water up and dumping on just cold water out of a well. But cold water in the summertime felt good. Didn't feel good in the wintertime. And the water was not clean. It was very dirty. And but that was our living conditions. We had on these wooden planks, we had a very, very thin little straw mat, or rice straw mat, about that thick, that we laid on. And then we were given 1 cotton blanket, and they gave us, for shoes, they gave us what we call Ho Chi Minh sandals. And they were made out of rubber tires. The sole was made cut out of rubber tire, and then the strap across, like a sandal, was made out of an inner tube. The only problem with that is I've got a size 13 quad E foot, and it was a year before they finally brought me a pair of shoes that I could wear. They were all too small. I tried to put them on, and I couldn't even get them on. And so it was well over a year that I went barefoot in the cell before I ever got anything I could put on my feet.
How about like food they fed you, and like where you spent most of the time in the prison? Well, you spent your time in your cell. Right. That was it. The only time you got out was when you went out to dump your toilet bucket. And you could step outside the door. They'd bring the food. You get fed twice a day. And in those early years, it basically consisted of rice, a very poor quality rice. It very often had little stones, and it had bugs in it. But as we soon learned, bugs are protein, so you didn't pick them out. And the other thing you got was what we call weeds and water, which was a small bowl of what I described as dandelion weeds boiled in water. And we would get fed that twice a day. They'd come around in the mornings, sometime around 9 or 10, and sometimes earlier, give you that, and you'd get another bit of that later in the day. And they'd give you one little, probably about a liter, maybe a little larger than a liter of water. It wasn't water, it was tea. It didn't have any real flavor to it, but they had to boil all the water. You couldn't drink any of the water that wasn't boiled over there because of the bugs, because of the poor quality of the water. Was there anything you looked forward to while in the camp, and what kind of things kept you going?
Well, those early years, you lived day to day. You lived from one day to the next, and that's all you projected towards. Your day was so humdrum. Once you got cellmates, then you had things to talk about. You had to whisper everything, because if you made any noise at all, the guards would come and harass you, and if you made any more noise, then you would go into punishment mode. But we looked forward, and our lifeblood throughout all that time was our communication. And we would, once we had more than one guy in a cell, then we had the ability to communicate and have somebody kind of on the lookout. And again, watching the shadow patterns on the ceiling of the cell and underneath the door, and those sort of things for warning. And we eventually in that camp had communication set up. And the building I was in most of the time over there was about 8 cells in one building, and we had full communication within that building. And then we ultimately had full communication from one building to another building. And that was very often accomplished by, we had some air vents very high up on the walls. And we would get on each other's shoulders, and we could stand up, and the vents on the adjacent building, they would be able to see us. And we would generally signal to them with a cough or something, they would come up. And we'd do this all in the afternoon during the siesta time when the guards were least active. And we could flash like this. We'd flash our same code, and we'd have something light in color. Then we could do that with these little air vent holes about that big, And our communication, eventually, we had total communication throughout the camp, where the senior officer of the camp may be in 3 buildings away, and passing. The reason this was very important was because when you came back from an interrogation, the first thing you would do, if you possibly could, was to get on a communication and let everybody else know what your interrogation was about, because that would generally help alert the other guys to say, okay, this is what I can expect when I'm called in. They want this and they want that, and this is what you can probably get. Kind of punishment you may get, in the whole thing. So you're constantly resisting that. And so the only thing that we look forward to now, some of the guys were offered the opportunity to communicate home, write letters early on. And why they were selected and did that, I don't know. I don't know that they were any more
like cooperative with
the enemy, or exactly what. I don't think so. I think in many cases it was kind of a random thing. But in any event, I never had that opportunity until 1970. It was the first time I was allowed to communicate home. My family thought they didn't know if I was dead or alive for over 3 years. So it was those that did get to write home. Of course, they couldn't sit in their room and write. They had to go into an interrogation room, and they had a little sheet of paper, and they'd sit down and they'd write a letter home, and then every once in a while somebody would get a letter. And when they got a letter back, why, that was big news. And but they were so sterilized. They knew what was written, and what was written back to us was so sterilized. If there was anything in the letter that came back that they didn't understand, it was discarded. We never got it, of course. If there was anything in the letter that we sent out that they didn't fully understand, it was discarded. So that was as far as looking forward. You'd look forward to, on really hot days, you'd look forward to going out and dumping some cold water on you, because you had heat rash generally so bad that your heat rash would start turning into boils in the summertime. And boils on your hip and your back and your shoulder blades, where you would be laying on your pad. And this little thin straw pad became so soiled that it would get infected. And you'd always look forward to the meals because you were always hungry.
Describe the prison guards.
Well, there's the regular guards that just patrolled the camp and then brought us food, and a few of them spoke some English, most of them not. Now, the interrogators, most of them were Vietnamese, North Vietnamese officers, and most of them spoke some English, some of them spoke very good English. The guards were a variety, and this was, I'm talking about the zoo, which was the camp I was in for this first period that I call Phase 1, which was through 1969. And they were businesslike to some extent. Other times they took great delight in antagonizing. Now, the first thing you have to remember, we learned the second day I was captured, you bow. They made us bow to them all the time. Whenever they opened the door, you bowed. Whenever they brought food, you bowed. Whenever you went to an interrogation, you bowed. And so that was just their method of making us subservient to them. And the one guard, I'll just describe the one guard that was my biggest nemesis that I had, and he was a guard that he would call a turnkey. He was the guy that opened my door almost every day and brought me food every day, took me out to dump my bucket every day, and then later on the group of us, the three of us that lived together. And we called him Pox because he had very severe smallpox apparently when he was younger. And he always carried a kind of a little bamboo stick in his hand. And as you walked out the door, he'd love to whack you with it. And that was just, it wasn't injuring, it was just irritating. And he would just, and sometimes if he was mad at you, he'd leave your food outside for sometimes up to 2 hours until you went out to get it. It would just be crawling with flies, those sort of things. But the interrogators, when you went into an interrogation, that was generally a scary thing. They generally did it at night. Generally, you'd come to your door, sometime after dark, tell you to put on, they give you the signal like this. That means put on your long sleeves, and you go into the interrogation. And they'd set you on a little short stool, and they'd have a light behind them, the typical thing there. And then the interrogator would start interrogating. And they basically, at that time, they wanted to know your biography. They wanted to know everything they could learn about you. And, what kind of an education you had, what college you went to. The most thing they wanted to know is if you were in any way affiliated with anybody of any political interest, or what your education was in college, whether it was the social sciences, soft sciences, history, mathematics, that sort of thing. And then they would, if it was the soft sciences, they would really zero in on you because they looked at the United States at that time and what was going on in the colleges, and most of the soft sciences, social sciences and everything, and the professors thereof were the ones that were the real strong leaders in the anti-war movement. So that's why they would try to zero in on that. But if you weren't cooperating, then things would get tough. They had tricks where you would get on your knees on a concrete floor and hold your hands above your head until you couldn't hold them there anymore. And when you started to drop your hands, then the guard was there and he had his stick and he'd whack you. And then things went from there. If they weren't getting the right cooperation, their next step was and sometimes they'd use the excuse of catching you communicating, and they would get the leg irons and they'd strap your legs to your bed. And then they'd set you in there on this plank. They'd take your little mat off, and then you put the handcuffs behind you. And then you would sit there for up to 36 hours, and you would urinate and defecate in your own sit. And you couldn't lay back, because if you laid back, you'd drive those handcuffs further into your wrists until it shut off circulation. And that was one of the ways that they would try to break you down. And then if they wanted a quicker way, they would put you into the ropes, and that's what I described earlier, where they would put a rope around your neck, put ropes around your upper arms, pull your arms back, you'd lay you down flat on the dirty old concrete floor, pull your legs up behind you, and then have a guard just kind of pull them up like that and hold them. And hold them, and then they'd tie it off so that pretty soon it'd shut off all your circulation in your arms. And your back just felt like in some cases your shoulders would just start to separate. And most of us had some limited shoulder capability since we came back because of that, some of those lovely treatments. And that, I think, was torture.
As you earlier explained, you mentioned something about having multiple roommates later on after you were moved around camps. Explain that, how it maybe pertains to John McCain being one of your roommates. Well,
I didn't get to know John or end up in the same camp with him until about the last 2 years I was there. But after our time at the zoo, which was basically through 1969, which was the toughest part of the ordeal, in early 1970, they moved a group of us from this camp, the zoo, out to a camp we called Camp Faith. And it was much better, improved conditions. We were no longer required to bow to our captors. Our food was a little bit better, and the conditions were better. And there was a group of 9 of us in a cell, and that was totally different. And there was a group, whereas before they kept you from seeing any other prisoner. They took you out completely on your own, and you were never really allowed to see or speak to another prisoner outside of your room, outside of the cell that you were in. And this, for the first time, after we got out to this new camp, Camp Faith, we were allowed to talk to the other guys that were in that part of the camp. When they walked by, we had actually bars and open windows where we could actually talk to them. And the guards didn't get upset when we did talk to them a little bit. And we got more showers. It was showers. When showers, you got water, out of the wells that kind of wash you up. And that was all going on through the summer of 1970. And there was a raid called the Santei raid. And let me tell you about that, because that affected a whole lot of what happened afterwards. Well, the Camp Santei, or we called it Santei, had been shut down, and all the guys had been moved into the Camp Faith where I was at. But we didn't know that here in the United States, and their intelligence obviously was not very good. And at that time, because President Johnson had stopped all overflights up there, we had no overflight intelligence except an occasional drone, and that was the only thing they had. Well, they knew that there were prisoners in the Santei camp, And so the order came down, and this was after President Nixon had taken over, and President Johnson had chosen not to run again. And they wanted to try to get a group out. So they set up the plan. There was a group of special operations people, Green Berets primarily, and they trained down in southern Florida on this camp. They had a mock camp built exactly like the exact replica of what the Santei camp was. Okay. And they put together a very elaborate plan, executed this plan flawlessly. They went into Santei. They were to crash an old helicopter in there with 3 or 4 guys to get them inside the camp to take care of the inside guards, and then they had other forces that would come in from the outside. And the plan went off flawlessly. The only problem was there were no POWs there. Our intelligence was such that they had lost track of us, so that they knew not me, but the other guys, they knew the POWs were in there up till about 60 to 90 days before the raid was called. And they weren't real sure. They almost canceled the raid. Then it looked like there's some people coming back into the camp, so they went ahead and launched the raid. And the raid went flawlessly. The only injury on the American side was that one of the guys that crashed the helicopters inside the compound broke an ankle. That was the only problem that they had, and they did in fact have a real shootout in there, and they did in fact kill a lot of North Vietnamese guards and some guards that they later determined were not Vietnamese but were large Caucasians, which were probably from the Soviet Union. Oh. And anyway, they got out, and immediately after that, and of course it was only about 15 kilometers from where we were at that time, we heard it all. And we heard something was happening. I mean, because they had all kinds of diversion activities, a lot of flights overhead. And next night, they loaded us up, blindfolded us, put manacles on us, put us in a big closed-in truck, and hauled us back into Hanoi. And they put us in the old prison where most of us had gone through before. The old Wallow prison. It was commonly called the Hanoi Hilton. And that was this time, instead of the Heartbreak area, we ended up in large cells that, the best way to describe that is if anyone's ever seen the old movie Papillon, and that's about a French prison on Devil's Island. I think the French had one plan for prisons, and that's what they built in Hanoi. It had rooms for the most part. The one that I went into would accommodate about 40 people, and they jammed about 60 of us into it initially. And there were some South Vietnamese prisoners in an adjacent cell, and one of the guys that I was with spoke pretty good French, and he was able to communicate with the South Vietnamese prisoners over there. And of course, they had found out what was happening to Santei raid. We had no idea what was happening. We just knew something went on down there. So that gave us an idea. So anyway, now we had about 60 guys in the cell that should have been 40 guys. And that was finally, eventually pared out to where we had about 40 in there. Once they moved the South Vietnamese prisoners to another camp, and that opened up some more rooms. So now we were in the Wallow prison, or the Hanoi Hilton, and in large groups, and the conditions were about the same. Our food conditions went down. They were a little more harsh on us because of the raid that was pulled over there. But the plus side of that was our morale was sky high, because here all of a sudden, okay, after all these years, hey, our country hasn't forgotten us. They're going to come get us. One way or another, they're going to come get us. And so they did. That was a good morale boost.
So tell me about anything about escape attempts and escape plans that you've dealt with and stuff.
Well, there were several escape attempts. The only one that was successful, and it really wasn't successful, it was successful for a couple of weeks, was a guy that was captured down near the DMZ, near South Vietnam. And he was actually ended up captured and sent back up north after he was shot. But from the camp I was at in the zoo, there was a escape attempt in the early summer of 1969. Actually, the zoo was made up of 2 parts. There was the zoo and the zoo annex. And the building that I was in backed up to the zoo annex. And so from where my cell was at, my cellmates and I, there were still the 3 of us, could actually communicate with the zoo annex. And we did communicate with those guys. Then there was 2 guys that effected an escape from there. It wasn't that difficult for them to get out of the camp, And they did. They made it out of the camp that night, but they were captured the next morning down by the river. Their plan apparently was to try to get to the Red River, which the Red River flowed down into the Gulf of Tonkin, and try to get a boat and go down that river. It was a real far-fetched plan, basically, and it was not coordinated. Now, any escape attempts were to be coordinated with the senior officer of the camp, and this escape attempt was not. And we knew something was on just by, we knew what the routine of the guards were. The next morning, things were all kinds of shouting and hollering and everything else. And out of a little cracked peek hole that we had in our cell, I could see what was coming in the front gate. And here were two POWs with ropes around their neck being run in front of a Jeep. They were good mud, just solid mud. And they were brought in, and we heard them for several days going through some horrible torture. And they killed one of them, tortured him to death, basically. The other guy survived. But then in the process, the Vietnamese became aware of how totally good our communication system was. That we had communication with the zoo, had communication with the zoo annex, and everything else. So that started a purge. And that was a very, very bad summer, probably one of our worst summers, because they just worked their way down from every senior guy in each cell block and every senior guy in each room, breaking down this cell thing. Well, they finally got to us, which was we were in the cell that communicated with the zoo annex. And so we spent quite a bit of time in our leg irons and didn't get to bathe for, 10 days, something like that, where your boils and your blisters got really bad. But anyway, that summer ended, and we made it through that summer, and like I say, at the end of that summer, things changed dramatically. And that's when they moved us out to Camp Faith. And I can talk a little bit later, or you can talk now, about why that happened. We didn't know at the time. It happened to coincide with the time that Ho Chi Minh died. And we thought, well, maybe the policies had changed because Ho Chi Minh died. We didn't know, but as later we come to find out, it was in 1969 when Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State, started negotiations, secret negotiations in Paris with a North Vietnamese man by the name of Lo Duc Tho, who was their foreign relations man. Now, they were all in secret, we didn't know, but at that time they felt, okay, we were going to be hostages, but they were going to treat us better because they knew then that they were going to release us at some point. So the treatment changed, and that was why it changed. It wasn't because Ho Chi Minh died. We didn't know that, of course.
Did you ever receive any news from the United States about what's happening in the United States, and any news about the progression of the war while imprisoned? We
didn't receive anything but what they wanted us to receive. And what they wanted us to receive, of course, was the worst news. I mean, anytime they, and they constantly in interrogations would tell us that they were winning, that they were, terrible losses that the Americans were having, and all that. So it was now, as far as news from the United States, the only news we got from the United States was the bad news. And of course, we got all the news whenever there was any, anti-war protesting. We were told, of course, that Jane Fonda had come to visit North Vietnam and was very much in support of the North Vietnamese. Anything like that, they gave us that information. We did not know, as you probably recall, when did we land on the moon? 1969?
I don't really know.
That was when we landed on the moon. Well, we didn't know about that until we were released in 1973.
Oh yeah.
So it was the only news we got was what they wanted to give us, and that was always bad news, such as the terrible incident at Kent State. Now they made sure we knew about that. Oh, yeah. And other than that, no, we didn't get any news from the States. Other than, like I say, the letters were so sanitized. There was nothing came in the letters.
Talk about your family and how they first learned about the fact that you were alive and that you were a POW.
That's quite a story. When I was at this Camp Zoo, and this was about 1960, late 67 or 68, there was a POW that was brought into the camp, and he was a young sailor. And he was on a destroyer that was operating fairly close in, obviously, off the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. And he had gone, it was a real rough night at sea, and he had gone up on what they call the fantail, the stern of the ship, to get some air, and a rogue wave hit, and he fell overboard. and he swam to shore and was captured by the North Vietnamese. And he ended up in our camp. Well, when we first, through our communication, we first got that word, I said, oh no, he's a CIA operative. He's a covert guy here to set up an escape for us. You know, you grasped the straws, and that was the straw we grasped. Well, come to turn out, that was exactly how he got there, and that's exactly who he was. But the North Vietnamese gave him pretty good free run of the camp, more so than any of the rest of us. And they put him in with this one Navy lieutenant commander. And this Navy lieutenant commander realized that they were prepping him to release him early for propaganda purposes. And so what he started doing is having him memorize names, and particularly names of those of us that had not had an opportunity to write home, and so that he could bring our names out. And he did. And he memorized these names through a little mnemonic sing-song thing that he would go over night, day, and in his mind over and over again. And he was told to go ahead and take this early release from the North Vietnamese because it wasn't costing him. He didn't have to give him anything. He didn't have anything to give him other than the propaganda of being released. And so this Navy officer that was cellmate with him told him to go ahead and take it. He's the only one who was released early that came home with honor. None of the others that took early releases came home with honor. Mm-hmm. No honor. And but this young man named Doug Hedgill came home, and he brought my name out among many others. And that's when my family was in late 1969, early fall of 1969, when my wife and my mother were notified that my status had changed from MIA, missing in action, mm-hmm. to POW. Mm-hmm. And so that's how they learned that I was alive. And I didn't get to write until after I went to this Camp Faith, and then I was allowed to write a letter. I think I got to write 3 letters over there and received 2 during the rest of the 3 years that I was there.
I understand that John McCain lived in the same cell as you for a period of time. Describe a little bit about being a prisoner with him.
Okay, well, you can go back up to when, after the Santei raid, we ended up in this in the Owalo prison, and large groups, 35 to 40 guys in a cell group. And at that time, we had good communication with our senior officers for the first time, because they had been kept there all along. And so they had been basically trying to get the Vietnamese to let us have church services, to hold church services, and have, kind of within the rooms, not all together, but within the cells, the large cells that we were in, to have church services. And it came up on Christmas of 1970, and we were pushing hard for that. Our senior officers were, and each one of our individual SROs within each cell was pushing hard for that. And we decided, well, we're going to go ahead and do it. When we started having it, then they'd come in and interrupt it. And it was, I believe it was either right before Christmas or right after Christmas, when one of the cell blocks, one of the other groups held a church service, and it was broken up by the North Vietnamese. And they took some of the senior guys out, took them out of the cell, and took them to another cell or to interrogations. Well, as they did, a group in that cell started singing our national anthem, mm-hmm. and they went ballistic. And when we in our cells and the other cells heard them start to sing, we all sang the national anthem, and they went ballistic. And of course, they thought they were having a riot, and they were in there with their guns immediately, and made us finally shut up. Everybody shut up. Well, then within an hour or 2 after that, they came in and they started pulling out different ones. It was dark by then. They started pulling out different people from each cell, and they pulled out about 24 of us from the different cells, including myself and John McCain, mm-hmm. and threw us in the back of a truck, hauled us out to a camp that we called Skid Row. This was a camp where they put us into solitary tiny little cells. They were filthy, had human feces on the floor. They were just terrible. And they threw us in there, and in solitary. Mm-hmm. And we were solitary out there, but we had good communication. We just ignored their ban on communications and communicated. They'd come in and shout and raise it. But because of the change in the policy, they didn't beat on us. Our senior officers spent some time in leg irons and manacles. because they held him responsible. And we were out there for about 8 months, and we did they would let us out in groups, even though we were in solitary. They'd let us out in groups to make coal balls, which was a mixture of coal slack and clay that they'd form into balls, which they burned in their stoves in order to heat water and cook the meals. And so that gave us a good chance to eyeball, chat with them. Well, John was only about 2 cells down, so we always got out there at the same time. Mm-hmm. Well, when they finally moved us back in, they took 19 of us back into Wallow Prison. When they took us all back into the Wallow Prison, they took 19 of us and kept us in 1 cell. And that was the senior guy that had been our senior man out there, and John McCain and some others. Out of that particular group, it was a pretty interesting group, our senior officer happened to be a man by the name of Bud Day, George Day, who was the highest, most decorated military man in the country today, including the Medal of Honor. We had another guy that was with us, and his name was Leo Forces, who was also a Medal of Honor winner. And then we had John McCain, of course, went on to became a senator. And who else? Well, and then we have Sam Johnson, who was also that group, and he's a congressman from Texas. Oh, wow. So it was a pretty interesting group of guys, to say the least. And I learned a great deal from those guys. I don't know if they learned anything from me or not, but I learned a great deal from some of those guys. And we were kept there together until the very end, when they started separating us to come home. They separated us to come home because we came home according to our date of shoot down. The early guys shot down, came home first group, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. What did you do to pass the time while imprisoned?
Well, like I say, communication was a big factor of it. Mm-hmm. We spent a lot of time communicating, and then in the later year, that last period of time that we were there for about the last 14, 16 months, where I was in there with these 19 guys, John McCain, these other guys, they actually let us have some playing cards. So we actually had a chance to play bridge and play some cards, and we did some other mental mind games. What we did in the early years is you would, as far as keeping your mind busy, you would start doing some memory exercises. And this communication back in those early years was critical, because as something to pass the mind and keep the mind busy, somebody would remember, they'd work out, they'd remember a poem from their, I don't know, junior high or the high school days. As an example, Kipling's "Oh, East is East and West is West," something like 46 verses. Mm-hmm. And we'd start relearning that through the wall, half a verse at a time, or a verse at a time. And then you just, a memory exercise. Guys that were very good at math, they would do math problems in their mind. We had nothing to write with, they wouldn't let us give us anything like that. And they would do math problems in their mind. But the memory exercise, that sort of thing, kept you going.
What were some of the things that you did to play cards to pass time?
Well, other than play cards?
Yeah.
Well, actually there was a lot, in particular that last year and a half, when we had time to spend with each other, and everybody had something to contribute. As an example, John McCain was a real history buff, and he really knew the Napoleonic Wars, all the European wars, inside and out. And we would have lecture nights, and the Vietnamese didn't like this, because they hated to see anybody one person talking to a group, because to them, in the communist mind, that is how they control people. And they didn't realize that basically that was an education thing for us. But they finally came around to not being too against it. But we would have lecture nights like that. We had one fellow that was very interesting. John McCain, of course, was a good history source. We had another fellow who had been a English. He was a professor at the Air Force Academy before he went back into the cockpit. And English literature, languages. Some of the guys would learn language. I had a pretty good start on learning Spanish from one of the guys there. And then we would, one of the most interesting ones that I recall was one of the fellows that wasn't in that group, but in a previous group that group at Camp Faith, where there was 9 of them, a fellow by the name of Jack Rollins that was a Navy officer, and he'd been an enlisted man for quite a few years before he became an officer, and in order to supplement his income, he became a butcher. And he was a journeyman butcher, and he would go through, and with a piece of brick, he would draw on the floor schematic of a beef, of a cow, and show you where all the cuts, where the prime rib came from, where the T-bone came from, where the ribeye steaks come from, where the flank steaks come from. Awesome. And it was very interesting. And he is also a very good amateur photographer, and he had actually photographed underwater because he was a diver, and had submitted photographs and articles to the National Geographic. So he was a very interesting guy to talk to. He's a PhD down in San Diego now that does work with the Scripps Institute.
So explain to me everything about being released from the prison system.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, back in 1969, as early as 1969, Henry Kissinger and Lou Ducteau had started secret negotiations in Paris. And that had gone on for a long, long time. Now we're coming up into 1972, and they're still negotiating with no end in sight. And so President Nixon at that time started another campaign that came partway up North Vietnam. It's called Linebacker I, trying to put more pressure on them to come to the negotiating table and negotiate for some kind of release. And we were prepared at that time and accepted the fact that we were going to withdraw our forces from South Vietnam. In fact, we had already started that as early as 1969, early 1970, in what we called the Vietnamization of the war. Mm-hmm. That's when our people started withdrawing from there, and were just basically in support for the South Vietnamese. And so in late 1972, the North Vietnamese miscalculated, and they walked out of the negotiations in Paris. And when they walked out of the negotiations in Paris, President Nixon ordered Linebacker II. Linebacker II was a full-on assault with our big heavy bombers, B-52s, which we should have used in 1965 over North Vietnam, but we didn't. But they launched the Linebacker II, and that was probably the most elatable night for us. It was 18 December, and we were all there in our bunks at probably about 11 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden we hear off in the distance, boom, 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 and we all knew exactly what it was. Whenever a B-52 drops bombs, it's a big string of bombs, because they all hit the ground at a little slightly different time. Right. And we heard that, and then of course everything just broke loose, and for the next 10 days, those B-52s came in there in Linebacker II, and really hit the North Vietnamese hard, and they couldn't wait to get back to the negotiating table. They came back to the negotiating table, and they negotiated, and they came to a settlement. And I'll talk about the settlement here in a minute, because that's quite interesting also. Mm-hmm. But that was an extremely exciting night of 18th December, and 10 days that followed. We took some heavy losses. Our B-52 guys did an absolutely marvelous job. When we were hauled in buses where we could see everything to Hanoi, or down to the Hanoi airport, when we were released, we could see the devastation. And all of it was the rail yards, and never touched any of the other things that were adjacent to it. Mm-hmm. I mean, they hit the targets the way they were supposed to hit the targets, with very little collateral damage. But anyway, we were, as a result of that treaty, in the agreement, then they told us in sometime about the middle of January that we were going to be released. And they got us all out in the big courtyard, and all of us together for the first time ever. And then their high-ranking officers got up there and told us that they had negotiated a peace settlement and that we were going to be released. And our deal had been released, and then as typical as the way it's supposed to be with any military, any of our military, is you release the sick and injured and civilians, and there were civilians up there. And the sick, injured, and civilians would go out first, then they would be released in accordance with the date of their shoot down. And obviously because they couldn't release them all at once, that was the deal, and that was negotiated and agreed to. And so I was supposed to come out of the second group, but because our press started getting the word as to how we'd been treated over there, and that was bad publicity for the North Vietnamese. They gathered up a bunch of guys, and they weren't collaborators or anything else, but they were guys that had not been badly treated, about 20 of them, and released them next to try to squelch the story that we'd all been badly released, or badly treated before we were released. And then I came out on the 4th of March. But the agreement of those negotiations is interesting, because the agreement was that there would be a ceasefire, exchange of prisoners, there would be free elections in South Vietnam, and then it'd go from there. Well, as we all know, there were no free elections in South Vietnam, and that war went on with the South Vietnamese fighting until 1975 for basically another 2.5 years. And the reason they could do that and chose to do that was because with President Nixon's demise over here through the Watergate debacle, they knew we would not come back into Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese anymore. So the end of that war was clear back in the early 72 and 73, not 75 as a lot of people like to think.
So you were released March 4th, you said, 1972?
73.
73.
Yeah. 4th of March 1973, yeah.
And you were taken in...
I was shot down on the 12th of September 1966.
Oh, wow.
Now that amounts to 2,365 days.
That's amazing.
I did count them after I came back. I got through this. When was I shot down? I didn't count them while I was there. You didn't do that. You never projected yourself more than 6 months before. You never looked back. It was not a healthy mental thing to be doing.
Explain your homecoming after getting out of prison.
Well, it was a very emotional time, obviously, and the whole operation, it was called Operation Homecoming, and the Air Force and all the other military branches did a great job in coordinating the whole operation. Mm-hmm. We flew out of Hanoi on C-141s, and we had about a 2-hour flight into Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Most of us spent about 4 days at Clark, going through our initial physical evaluation, taking medicines to get rid of all the parasites, the bugs and stuff that we had contracted during that time, and any emergency medical stuff at that time was taken care of, and we were able for the first time to call home and talk to our families. Oh, yeah. And then after about 4 days there, and they fitted us up with new uniforms, and of course those of us that had been promoted, which most all of them had because we'd been here so long, put us on new rank and all that sort of thing. And then we flew back to designated bases here in the States. Those of us that came back to this part of the West Coast flew into Travis Air Force Base over here by Fairfield, California. They had a regional hospital there that could take care of all of our medical facilities. Of course, the Navy guys in Southern California, the same thing into San Diego, and same thing all the way across the country. I flew into Travis and spent about 2 weeks there. Had to have some surgery and had to have a lot of dental work done. And that was all taken care of. And of course, my family was right there with us. So the homecoming was very well coordinated by the military. The thing that was difficult for most of us coming home, of course, things had changed so much in those years. The turbulent 60s, not into the 70s, and not just superficial things, but morals and many other things had changed dramatically. It was a little difficult for us to adjust to that. But I think one of the most difficult things for me was I came home and we were all, it was such a big media event, and we're all treated like heroes and all of that sort of thing. But then we became more and more aware of how poorly and how shabbily our guys who had served over there, gone over, served their year over there, many of them draftees, although actually only about a third of them were draftees. Mm-hmm. 2/3 of the guys that served over there were volunteers, which a lot of people didn't realize. And they came back and were absolutely shunned. If they went back to college on the campuses, they didn't dare mention any thing about being veterans, or they were just basically spat upon in some cases. So that was a difficult thing, and still is. And I think it was probably one of the low points of the history of our country.
What was it like readjusting back into normal life?
That was difficult. It was probably more difficult on our families than it was on us. In my case, and I think many of our cases, we had lost 6.5 years of our lives. We hit the ground running, and I chose to stay in and finish a career in the military, and I wanted to make up that 6.5 years tomorrow. Well, that's not possible. I think we all hit the ground running a little too hard and too fast, and didn't pay enough attention to how it affected our families.
Do you have any contact today with any of the other prisoners whom were in the prison with you?
Oh yes. we have a very active organization called NAMPOWs Incorporated. And it was formed just a year after we got back. And it's an incorporation that was incorporated in the state of Arizona. Okay. And we have reunions, national reunions, just about every 3 years. Now we don't all make all of them, obviously, because we've had other things going on. But the last one was actually down here in San Diego just last month. I was unable to make that one because I had to go back to Denver because of a family illness back there. But we've made probably maybe half of them since we came back. But yes, we do have a very close organization and stay up a great deal on. And you have other old cellmates that you are a little closer to and stay a little more contact with.
What kind of recognition have you received from the military or the government after your experience?
Well, I can show you that right here, basically. These are most all of my awards and decorations. And starting with the one in the upper left there is called the Silver Star. And the cluster right here, the oak leaf cluster, means it was awarded twice. One was awarded for missions that I flew before I was shot down, a mission that I flew before I was shot down, a particular mission. And then the second was awarded for some of my activities as a prisoner of war, basically in resisting the exploitation and communication and that sort of thing. The other one over here is the Legion of Merit, and one of those was awarded again for time that I was spent in prison. And the cluster, the second one, was awarded for being a commander of an organization after I came back. I was commander of a couple of organizations, and the last organization I was commander of, I received the Legion of Merit. And you get the Bronze Star, which is that down there, the Bronze Star, what they call the V device. And there's 2 clusters on that, so that's been awarded 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And that's was for some other missions and some for the activities as a POW. And then the other one, of course, is the Purple Heart down there. And the Purple Heart has one oak leaf cluster, and the first Purple Heart basically was awarded when I was shot down with the burns that I received. And actually, I did break the fibula in my leg when I was ejected and landed. I didn't know that till some years later when the X-ray said, "What did you do that?" And I said, "I don't know. It must have been that." And then the other one was for some of the torture and brutality that I took during the Vietnam as a POW.
How do you view Vietnam as a country today? How do you view the Vietnam War as a whole? And have your views on the war or Vietnam as a country changed from the beginning of the war to the end?
That's quite a bit, but we'll give it this shot. I have not gone back to Vietnam. Many of my former POWs, fellows that have gone back, many of them I felt maybe it was a bit of a closure. I have no desire to go back. I think Vietnam has, once they could no longer rely upon the Soviet Union to support them, because let's face it, that was part of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and they pretty much had to fend on themselves. And being very resourceful people, which they are, they have done so. There are still, I know today, there are still some labor camps where many of the people that were our allies in South Vietnam are in those labor camps today. Many of them have died up there. And I don't know how much is brought out by the thousands, tens of thousands, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, that gotten anything that floated to go to the Gulf of Tonkin to try to escape the communists. And that's not really very well known or documented, but that in fact was it. Now they're doing quite well today. Obviously we're buying, we're trade agreements, and normalization with Vietnam was the right thing to do. You cannot continue to operate in the world without normalizing things. I think today they practice what is called red capitalism, and that is that they still are a communist country, and they understand the value of capitalism, and what it can bring their country, and keep their country afloat and viable. Like I say, I have shirts and stuff like that were made in Vietnam, and so I have no animosity towards the Vietnamese people. Let's face it, half of them were my allies, and they served very well. And a lot of the guards that I did deal with, many of them enjoyed what they were doing. Others were just soldiers doing their job, and you have to appreciate that. So I don't have any animosity in that regard whatsoever. Now, as far as the war itself, I believed at the time that I was fighting it, it was the right war to fight. I believe today it was the right war to fight. We unfortunately, our leaders chose not to fight the war and go to its completion. And there were a lot of outside influences on that, the media being one, and the anti-war movement, which was started and stimulated primarily in academia here in our country, that forced us out of that. I think if we had stayed in there and done the job properly and really fought the war to win it, we would have a South Vietnam today and I believe a flourishing democracy. But we bailed out on our allies, and that's how I view it. I think we left our allies and we left them in a lurch. And so it cost many, and I think that's evidence of what happened in Cambodia after the Vietnam War. Because the North Vietnamese and the communists in Cambodia, the killing fields, I don't know if you've heard that term before, but there was a movie that was made of the killing fields. There were literally millions of people slaughtered in Cambodia after we pulled out of that part of the world, and the North Vietnamese and their lackeys, I call them, who were the communists in Cambodia, went in and just slaughtered villages. And for some strange reason, there wasn't really much coverage of that by the press here in the United States. So that bothers me greatly. But that's my views on the war then and now.